So, I mentioned that my name is Sergey already, right? So enough of introduction for that. Tonight I'm gonna talk about all various tools that performance engineer or people who care about performance might be using in their arsenal. It's not a full comprehensive list, but I try to get as many of them as possible and kind of cover everything that is immediately on my mind, at least. That being said, it's not going to be a very technical deep talk necessarily, because each of those tools is probably worth many, many hours of discussions and presentations. So it's going to be relatively high level, and I apologize if you expected to know absolutely everything about it. Sorry, you will have to go to one of those, to 5 of those conferences probably for a few years to learn all of that. So it will be relatively shallow in that sense, but I hope it will be still worth it. So, how many of you use tools like New Relic or tools that help you show how fast your web server does? Okay, okay, quite a few, right? So, this is traditionally the tools that we all had, and they luckily got developed pretty well, and they show you how your servers perform in which code, like your database queries or your application stack or some other stack performs, right, under load. So when you have your users coming to the server, you will see that, hey, my database cannot keep up with this many users and things like that. So it is a very popular tool to use because it answers one of the important questions. Will my site actually scale beyond development, right? I'm developing, it's like 2 users, me and my buddy in the next cube, we using that, but is there, is it going to be sustained after all of those billions of users will come when I do all the marketing spend and all that, right? It is very important because obviously, as we all know, performance usually degrades with amount of load. It does degrade in different ways, and in making sure that it degrades the least is our goal. Otherwise, we'll spend so much on technology and spend a lot of time on also making sure that it's available, right? Not only scalable, but also available, that it doesn't go down altogether. That being said, these tools primarily address scale and availability questions. And they measure performance to understand where it degrades, but they do not necessarily show you how and where to improve performance. I mean, where maybe a little bit, right? Which stack in which particular case they help. They degrades under load, right? But they concentrate on scale and availability. Again, they do performance measurement of all of that, and invaluable tools in that sense, and load testing tools that apply load to your server to emulate real case scenarios and things like that. But their mindset is in availability and scalability. And I'm not going to talk about those tools tonight, because I will concentrate on the tools with a mindset of performance. Our group is generally trying to answer the question, is that user satisfied with the speed of your website, and how does that affect their behavior, right? If it's one user, is it fast, right? Indeed, you don't necessarily need load testing for one user, right? I'm obviously kind of specifically changing the picture to show from another perspective. It doesn't mean that these tools are not necessary. Absolutely. Things, when they degrade, especially when availability is going south, when they degrade to that level, performance will be affected. No one is questioning that, right? But there are plenty of evidence that performance can be degrading without extra load. sorry, not degrading, can be degraded without additional load. And that's what the web performance optimization field is about. So tonight I'm going to concentrate on those tools specifically. So, sorry for a long introduction. I actually gave a talk on scale versus performance that concentrated just on that. Tonight I'm going to cover two major parts of the pie. It's performance analysis tools, trying to figure out what's wrong. We'll go through some kind of historically through things, but also, well, I guess tools develop historically, right? So the most important ones first, and then over and over they kind of get better and better. So it will be both historical and kind of go into depth with that. And then the second part is optimization tools, things that we can use to actually improve performance. And I will talk about a few different kind of parts or areas of your work that you would need to pay attention to. So, without knowing what's slow, or even forget about slow, without knowing what's going on in your website, you have no clue how to optimize it. Trust me. Everybody out there, if they don't have experience in this field, if you tell them, hey, what's slow, they will pick the wrong thing. And I'm not saying which particular, or they will have that bias or this bias. They just don't know. And because of that, sorry, let me backtrack. That primarily is happening because we are using our own eyes, ears, and other senses to feel it, right? But computers work in a very different way, and we cannot really perceive the reality with our perceptions necessarily. Moreover, we all know that developers have very different environments than actual users. Because of that, you should use tools and rely on tools to tell you what's going on, right? You can make that do that experiment and ask a developer what's wrong, measure, or sorry, ask them to measure. It's not polite to measure and behind their back. Ask them to measure and look at what the result is and if their perception actually matched. I do it constantly. They do it voluntarily, sorry, but you know, but it's a challenge. So we'll start with tools that help us understand what's wrong. So historically, this started with a tool called Wieslow at Yahoo, where Steve Souders' team, exceptional performance team, they basically tried to analyze performance issues of various Yahoo properties and created automated testing tools to test best practices, right? They created a list of a few rules in this, and they tried to codify how to measure those things, like how many requests will page make, because apparently amount of requests affected performance, right? Or how big are those requests and things like that. They derived all of that from statistics about correlating performance metrics with actual business statistics, right? And they created those rules, which became a very useful tool, and that's how performance, they were able to sell performance within Yahoo, right? It basically gave you a grade and a list of things that you can optimize, right? PageSpeed is another tool developed by Google after that. Now it's called PageSpeed Insights, specifically for that field of their PageSpeed initiative. It's basically, this is how PageSpeed Insights web service looks. So they also have a browser extension, right, and a library that you can use. They have all kinds of tools, but essentially what it does, it tells you, hey, these are the things that you should fix because they are much lower than where they should be. In this particular case, it was blocking JavaScript and CSS above the fold, right? You should pay attention to that. Then they say, well, you should probably fix all of those things because they kind of for particular reasons, they in okay state, right? Not good enough, but not completely terrible. And what's important about those, they actually link to description of what that means, they're linked to this documentation of what to do, and this is a great way to start, right? If you never did performance optimization, run like this PageSpeed Insights. If you type it in Google, they will lead you to the page. I forgot the URL. I think it's google.com/pagespeed, something like that. It's a great way to start. Now, actually, the PageSpeed also added the, well, screenshot, which is awesome. They tell you, oh, we actually loaded your page, right? And they also have two rule sets, mobile and desktop, right? And YSlow also, by the way, both YSlow and PageSpeed are open source, and they added they have multiple rule sets. You can add your own and stuff like that. But the idea here is that the best practice is codified to be testable automatically, right? And they give you some kind of grade, or some of them want to move away from grades. It's kind of complicated how to compare things between each other, right? But generally, they give you kind of score, and up until you have 100, you have a thing to do, right? Kind of simple motivator, simple way to sell your business that, hey, until you're at 100, you still need to spend money on performance. At this point, when you use this tool, that's enough, right? Go until you get very high, right? And historically, that's how we all started doing this. So it's pretty awesome. Now, there is another thing. And another problem, there is a problem with those best practice and rule tools in that it's codified for you, right? You don't know how one thing affects another, right? One rule's a kind of good high-level explanation, but which script specifically to do to optimize, and why the hell do I need to do exactly that? How will it help me? It doesn't kind of close that loop. They kind of, the best practice tools, they kind of tell you, okay, we identified that problem with that file, right? Or at least for some rules, they can say that specifically. But generally, they don't tell you, don't close the loop on how do I optimize, if I optimize, how will things change. It kind of doesn't give you in-depth look at what's going on a website. It only tells you that just do this, it will be better. For that, we have an awesome tool called WebPageTest. It's double awesome, maybe even triple awesome. We use that at Meet for Speed sessions every time. And essentially, what it attempts to do is it does synthetic testing. It goes, fetches your website with a real browser. But there's no real person clicking, but the browser is real. And it measures, it collects as much information as it can from during that process. So it creates one of those charts on the top right corner. It's called waterfall chart, right? It kind of, for each request, it collects information of different types of information. Like you can see, it's color-coded, it's huge. Well, these days it's huge because pages are huge. It kind of measures and tries to create count some metrics, including, by the way, PageSpeed scores, because PageSpeed is open source library. So you can kind of use WebPageTest as a starting point anyway. And it gives you a lot of background information to be able to try to identify the issues. Like, for example, if I see that the blue bar on my first request is too long, and on the second request starts only after that, maybe I need to shorten whatever that blue bar, and blue bar is a download in particular. Yeah, if you attend Meet for Speed, you know the colors, trust me. You know, but basically, you kind of can start to reason of why things are different, right? And you can rerun it every time, and you will see how that changes, and you will see what actually happens, or at least as close to reality as you can. It's also awesome when you need to sell your boss on the idea of performance, because it can generate the film strip view of every 100 milliseconds it makes screenshot, and you can see, hey, this is this showed up at that moment and this didn't. Oh, what the hell is wrong with it? And then you can go and create awesome videos comparing your either unoptimized site to optimized site or your site to the competitor site, how that loads. Awesome altogether. So if we will have time, maybe, well, I doubt we'll have time, but you can come to our Meet for Speed session and we can look at webpage test specifically, because that's a large chunk of what you need to learn up in the beginning. How to read all of those metrics, how to reason, and there are many more things, by the way, that it does. That you can do a lot with it. So when first tools came out, I wrote a show slow, which is a tool that lets you track the metrics that are the best practice scores, or eventually we integrated with webpage test as well. Collect those metrics and track them over time to see if your development made any changes, or if, well, maybe it's not your development, maybe it's your content editors who added huge images, right? Things like that. How did it affect the metrics that you were collecting, right? And you can check the checkboxes on every metric and all of that, and trend them over time, and it supports some other features and things like that, including custom beacons and stuff. But it basically collects data from all of those tools and just stores and graphs them, nothing more. All right, which is great because it allows you to track and pay attention to trends in your performance work, right? And I believe it's awesome. I wrote it. Who would say otherwise, right? But there is a challenge. If you remember, in the previous slide, it said synthetic testing, right? And I said there's no person clicking in there. It's actually a real browser, but it's not a real person in not a real conditions. Because to be able to collect that much information, you really need a controllable environment where you gather a lot of information, derive those metrics, and because of that, it cannot be done on every user's computer, right? It has to be in a test environment, right? In synthetic traffic, and we all know that you cannot emulate your real traffic. I mean, if you don't know, it's kind of logical, right? If I'm at Starbucks on iPhone versus in India on my laptop, or in the on a plane with my watch or whatever that is, conditions are all different. And unlike all of those backend systems where all of your servers are controlled, and that's why I kind of draw that line between things that measure scalability issues and the application performance on the backend with the performance tools. These are heavily depend on real users, or depend on the real users conditions. And that's where demand for a better measurement solution for reality for those real users became apparent. And W3C had a spec called Navigation Timing API, and that, if you know the word, that chart is probably familiar to you, very weird kind of animal or insect or something. It's basically all the events for the page that happened, like from starting the request to connection to rendering and things like that, right? These are things that are available in many modern browsers to consume, right? Basically in a JavaScript code, you can go window.performance. Read the value and just send it to back to your server, and can collect that information for every user, right? And that's what is called real user measurement, or RUM for short, right? And why is it important? It's important because it collects the breadth of the data, right? It never shows you one value, like it took 5 seconds to load your page. Well, no, it couldn't take 5 seconds for everybody in the world. And you cannot just say average or anything. Average is just not the way to go. We actually had Grant Ellis from InStartLogic talk about measurement. And actually, frankly, since then we had a few other speakers too talk about measurement, and averages is just not the way to measure, right? No one needs the temperature, average temperature in the hospital, right? Every patient has their own situation, right? So usually they draw your data in this log normal distribution way, right, where there is some majority of your users kind of shown on the left, hopefully, right, and there's a long tail, but it's kind of complicated, right? So you can see the whole picture for every metric that you measure, whole picture of varying performance, right, for those users. And the goal is still the same, shift all of that to the left, right? If it's zero, if it's like happening in one moment, that's the best. Well, zero never happens, right? Only if you see the zero, it means that you had an error in your tool, right? By the way, it applies to all the tools. Tools are written by people. They can have bugs. They can have limitations. So don't trust them blindly, right? Enough said there, because some people just pray to Wieslow or something. But generally, this lets you see the picture and lets you see the trends and changes in your performance over time. It's just not one number anymore, right? It's kind of a whole dimension. So here on the chart, horizontally, it's the amount of seconds it took to load the page, and vertically, it's how many users experienced that, right? So it's not performance over time, it's a snapshot of performance at that particular point across all the users, right? Again, Soast and CatchPoint have a products like that, and there are many other things you can do with such products. For example, correlate. Let's say with that beacon that you on your page, you can send some useful information like how much money did that user bring me, or if you cannot measure money, like were they logged in or not? What kind of experience were they having? I mean, which version of your software did they use at that moment? And then you can correlate and draw the kind of visually see the difference between how it affects users on the right end of the graph, on the left end. If you actually have much more complicated distribution, maybe that consists of, okay, logged in users are faster generally, right, and logged out, sorry, and logged in users are kind of to the right because maybe a server is slower or something like that, right? Or for any other, maybe they use much more functionality of the site and it just takes longer to actually work, right? So this gives you a much better perspective of what's going on in the real user scenario. The trouble with this kind of tools, though, is that they cannot collect as much information as WebPageTest kind of tools or synthetic tools collect. It's just not realistic to send the information describing the whole user experience back. Right? Imagine, like, we sent them information to build this experience, then we collected all the metrics around it, and we're sending all of that back. It's just not realistic, right? So because of that, the information is relatively limited. It's these APIs, plus vendors also try to kind of devise their own additional tests, maybe, that try to collect more data and send back, but it's much smaller in volume per user. Because of that, this generally helps you understand trends and connections to business metrics very well, right? Because you can actually know each user experience and derive, again, the revenue that to performance correlation, for example, in the best cases, things like that. But it doesn't help you understand what's going on inside the system, which part can you optimize to speed it up, right? And because of that, this is primarily for business correlation and kind of for understanding your trends and the kind of business situation. But synthetic tools are usually for developers to actually go and speed it up after that. So I don't think one of them can be used without another. So now we have RAM. This is awesome. Again, this is one of the latest established technologies on the market, fields, I should say, not technologies. I don't know how we lived without RAM before that, to tell you the truth. It was always, you know, yeah. And generally, when we were trying to sell the performance business case without having RAM data, we tried to sell it using static tools, and well, that's why I built ShowSlow, for example, right? That's how it all originated. And there was a relatively hard challenge in there because information that you have in synthetic testing doesn't really connect to business metrics. You can do that, right? There's still correlation still exists, right? But it's relatively distant. There is much harder to draw specific parallels, and you know, it was a challenge. Okay, one other kind of last class of measurement and measurement tools is browser profiling. For a while in the web performance optimization field, we were thinking about kind of how page gets to the browser, because, well, traditionally pages were not applications. They primarily lived a very short life in the web page. You download it, you look at it, click, go to the next page, right? For quite a while that, well, still the case. For many businesses, that's still the case. And frankly, network performance and all of that stuff that sitting between the server where you have it, or many servers, various servers where you have the data and the actual users where they sit, all of that environment is very much unknown and uncontrollable and pretty wild out there, right? Because of that, we concentrated on the network and delivery and things like that. The trouble is that we started to use web as an application distribution system, right? And web became apps. Web became an app platform, and browser became a thick client, essentially, right? And not thin as it was before, but thick, where a lot of application logic and interaction. I mean, think games, for example, right? Games playing in the browser, right? So for that reason, we started to think about web performance in a sense of how game developers started to think about it, right? How many frames per second can we render? How fast can we execute code in the browser? Those millions of lines of JavaScript that we wrote for it, right? How fast can we re-render and change positioning and things, or have interactivity? I mean, games are extreme case. Not all of you probably work on games, but many sites are interactive now, right? A lot of them, especially when they load, to even start to render the first thing, you need to lay them out very well, and you know, especially if it's responsive, and I mean, there are 2 million rules that how it behaves under which condition and all that. Because of that, we need to really know what's going on inside the browser while it renders, and they were black boxes. As much as networks were black boxes, as much as the servers were black boxes. Before them, browsers are black boxes. They were developed by highly skilled developers, all 5 of them, you know, in the silo somewhere in Seattle, or I don't know where Mozilla is. I believe everywhere, or California, whatever. You know, and we had no clue how they worked. We kind of were promised, oh, it interprets HTML and just makes a page out of it. Right? Really? That's much more complicated as we know today, right? Firebug was one of the first tools that helped us look into how browsers work, but they didn't necessarily have as many tools to measure inner workings. And Chrome really changed the world in that sense. Well, there were other third-party tools like Dynatrace, Ajax, for example, had a very detailed view into Internet Explorer in particular. Still has, by the way. It's a free tool as well, not open source. And Chrome, I believe somehow there is some relationship between Chromium project, Chrome, and Safari. So I actually don't know who works where, but Chrome basically introduced a lot of very detailed tools that let you see things like on the bottom right, it's like what is being called on the page to make things happen, right? And color-coded and very detailed, and it's like it's renders, parsings of JavaScript, execution of JavaScript, CSS parsing, layout, paint, God knows what else, right? The browser does, and it does a lot. It's one of the most complicated pieces of general-purpose software out there, actually. So you can do profiling like this, collect the data, and see, hey, I see something fires up a lot, right? For example, if you attach the wrong handler to the scroll event, very common mistake that affected the rendering a lot. You scroll and it just jugged, right? You can just look at, hey, why am I recalculating this thing or recounting amount of nodes in my document every time people scroll? It doesn't really change that much, right? So things like that. It helps a lot with that. And by the way, Chrome Inspector has a few additional tabs in there. Like, it's a complicated tool in its own, developer tools for Chrome. But it has that, you see that blue thing in the top right corner in that main image? I wonder if I thought it has the red dot thing. But it doesn't. Anyway, there are a few tabs where you can enable additional features, because measuring always affects how browsers work. You don't want to run measurement tools in your as a user in the browser. But you can enable things like continuous rendering, right? Where browser will keep re-rendering the page all the time, which is very useful when you enable that frames per second counter, right? You can see how the browser actually, how long the browser will take in the worst case scenario, right? For visible part of the page, for example. Or show me borders for repaints. Every time you, let's say, hover over something, what is being repainted, right? Things like that. It's a very comprehensive set of tools. I mean, there is memory management, by the way, for if you write games. That's terrible. It's the hard part, basically. Or you have a lot of objects on the page that constantly change or something. So very comprehensive set of tools. So check out Chrome Developer Tools. Their development evangelism team constantly talks about it. Yeah, Kai. Yeah, they basically partnered with Google. It's an awesome resource. Thank you, Kai. Yeah. And you can watch countless videos by Paul Irish and his team about magic of speeding up things up with all of the front-end performance tricks. So that kind of covers somewhat. I mean, there are obviously plenty of ways to understand and measure things online of the user experience and things like that. But those are the primary fields where you need to concentrate to understand what is wrong with my pages, right? Or at least what's going on with my pages before you understand what is actually wrong, right? Again, you will need to work with your business to identify the business metrics and, well, yeah, let me say this, you should work with your business to identify the business metrics, because performance is not free. You cannot just do it once or spend a little bit of time on that, right? You need to pay attention to it, because if you don't, performance only degrades. Naturally, because with more features, with more development over time, you add complexity. Complexity always leads to performance degradation. It's impossible to keep performance going without knowing what's going on. In terms of metrics, just impossible. I wouldn't be building that show slow tool if I had any alternative. You know? So partner with your business. Use tools like RUM to connect to actual business metrics. They're pricey, unfortunately. Oftentimes they are a vendor because it's complicated big data challenge. So. But it's well worth it, because that will help you sell the performance initiatives in your business, right? Help you define the connection between your work and the bottom line, no, whatever finance calls that line that indicates how much salary you get, right? And at the same time, pay attention to those developer tools, the synthetic tools, because without them, you will not be able to optimize. You will not know how page loads. Many developers I interview, they have no idea that this HTTP protocol that they all memorize the name of, that it actually works somehow. It's not just magical thing out there that just connects server and the client, right? But it actually makes actual requests, and if you send too much, it will take longer, or whatever complications are, right? So I would say it this way. While you're working on selling your business case, it gives your developers the lens to look at their process, right? The synthetic tools. By the time business is good, with you paying attention to performance, developers will know what's going on, right? Don't necessarily expect them to know it in advance. right? Don't blame yourself that you didn't know. Just start learning all of that, you know. And keep learning, because a lot of those best practices, a lot of those tools either break under new conditions, or best practices change with new protocols and browser improvements and things like that. So you have to pay attention, right? None of the browsers that are primary browsers today existed when this meetup started, for that matter, right? And many browsers that were pain in the ass at that moment don't exist anymore. They exist in a museum and at a few computers in a place where they don't change computers, you know. But in terms of proportions of traffic, they're very different. So keep learning. And I catch myself at the Meet for Speed sessions that I'm saying some optimization, and I'm like, sorry, this is not as critical anymore, or if the optimization, the improvement that you need to do is actually different today because the browsers now actually do much better with particular problem, right? So keep that in mind. So after you know what's going on, what's wrong, or what's maybe not wrong, but it's current status quo, you need to make it faster. And I hope we all agree that you do need that, right? Who thinks that slower is better? Okay, I agree. There are edge cases to everything. I mean, moreover, I would say that the tolerance, to performance tolerance for people actually varies based on their need, what they want to have from computer, right? It's known from RAM data, actually. Philip Tellis from SOSTA a couple years back was talking about the trends for bounce rate over performance, right? For some businesses like e-commerce, your bounce rate goes pew, like the moment you wait extra, there is a competitor right next to you, easy. But for games, it's different. Like the people came to play this game, and you cannot really do anything. You cannot really call them into conference room or something. They will play that game. You know, they will wait forever. So the tolerance is different, absolutely. The effect is different. Sometimes maybe slower helps too. But it's better if you can have a fast application and introduce the slowness in the right moment than if you have slow application and cannot do anything about it, right? Exactly, exactly. And you often think that your website is just fast. It's fast, come on. Tell me, is your website slow? Maybe if you come to this meetup every day, every website is slow by now. Like you just cannot stand it. I mean, every website is just slow, right? You always know how to make it faster. But generally, we just don't pay that much attention because it's not a priority, right? So measure, use the tools to measure and see where the performance troubles are. And usually you will find that you didn't expect the performance problem to be there. It's actually so easy to fix that it will just, like, you know, it can be coded in the rules. You can just read the rule and just fix it, and you will have a huge increase in performance immediately, right? So measure. Before you want to optimize that SQL query that you have to shave off 1 millisecond, right? Maybe you should optimize enable gzip compression to speed up your website altogether in 10 minutes it takes to do. Okay. So it's important, after you measured, after you understood what's going on, it's important to ingrain the performance into your process. And since web is one thing that has that notion that source code needs to be available to the person who uses it, for whatever reason, actually that's why web exists, frankly, if you ask me, it means that there is a gap between how you code and how it is easy to consume the code and build the application, and what's easy to develop generally, right? And what needs to be happening, right? How the code needs to execute in production. And because of that, you cannot just have the code. I mean, in the very simple applications, it's possible to just always do it manually. But reality is that you just have to have it as part of your build process, right? And your work will probably include things incrementally. You will start building that process, or like starting with the simple things like combining and minifying JavaScript and CSS. It's very well-known traditional best practice to do so, to reduce the amount of requests and reduce the effect of latency on your web pages. And then you will say, hey, we also need to use the CDN, so let me abstract away my URLs so I can always switch from my local developer environment to CDN, and so you will need to have some more code in your application, or maybe in your build process to transform the application, or real time. It's up to you. But so one by one, you will have to have that stuff implemented. Obviously, the next step is, since JavaScript and CSS are two core components to your web pages, basically until CSS is there, nothing shows up, right? Page doesn't render these days. And JavaScript, you kind of want to load as little of it as possible to make sure that it doesn't block or it doesn't interfere with page rendering. You want to make sure that you manage your JavaScript properly and using, well, one very common tool is called Require.js Optimizer that kind of helps you manage dependencies and things like that, and just load enough, right, on the page. And object-oriented CSS is an approach to to reduce the amount of styling that will produce the very same result, right, or a result that you actually want to achieve, and not all of those tons of styles that you developed over the years, right? It kind of helps you think abstract, like in object-oriented development, about your objects. Object-oriented development is usually like Java objects on a server. Object-oriented CSS is about rendering object and look and feel of your pages, right? Nicole Sullivan developed that concept and talks a lot about that. It's a very important approach. There are other things that you can do about CSS, but kind of managing that is very important. And one other one is optimizing images during build process, right? Because you will never do it manually, right? So for images that you as a developer upload to the website, you should have something that makes them smaller. Well, there's a whole talk about image optimization, but to optimize images, right? It's a right moment in time between the moment when you did development and the moment when code is ready to be executed on the site, right? So Compass is a CSS tool and a whole framework for building CSS that helps abstract your CSS, manage your CSS in generally, including improving performance of it. And there are many other Grunt tools. And by the way, sorry, I forgot to mention, Grunt is now a new build tool for front-end, right? If you ever used Make and other Ant and whatever, so this is specifically for front-end. People in front-end just decided that they have to write their own tool in JavaScript, and they did, right? And there are a few new tools that kind of replace it. They thought, oh, Grunt just going in the wrong direction. Let us start from scratch and do another tool. So there are plenty of tools these days, but Grunt is the stable tool with the most coverage at the moment. Everybody has a Grunt plugin. So Compass is CSS tool. Require.js has a couple pieces to it, but one of them is optimizer part, where it will go and pick, based on dependencies that you define in your modules, it will pick the ones that you will use on this page, right? It's not doing static analysis of the actual code, what executes. It kind of helps you manage your own code, right? And there are many more. In addition to having those actual optimizations, you might want to have automated tests that are not functional tests, right, like that depend on your code, but tests that help you understand, did you degrade performance? Did you reduce performance? Did you do the best generally about it? And one of the very known ones is JSLint by Douglas Crockford. And if you don't like Douglas Crockford, then it's JSHint, which does exactly the same thing, but without Douglas Crockford in it. Essentially, it kind of does that. Those tools do static analysis of the code and try to tell you what you're doing wrong. JSLint and JSHint don't necessarily have performance rules in them, right? But I generally found that if developers write better code and understand why Douglas Crockford wrote all of that, well, JSLint, and why those tools exist, they will have better understanding of how JavaScript needs to work, right? But CSSLint in particular, it's a tool by Nicole Sullivan and Nicholas Zakas. They released it, by the way, at Velocity a couple of years back, right at the conference. It was awesome. They actually have a section of CSS analysis rules that works specifically for performance, right? So it will tell you, don't do this because it actually degrades performance and increases the layout time and stuff like that, right? And you can embed those tools either in the build process one by one, like developer types build, and it tells you, no, I'm not going to build it because you just degraded the performance of our website, or you forgot that you shouldn't use IDs in your CSS, right? And you should use classes instead, right? Something like that. Or you can use that in a continuous deployment scenario where you measure that, well, either completely block deployment, right? Or you measure some metric of performance using these or some other tools, and kind of when it reaches a threshold, you just, or reduces the quality, then you go and warrant the break on deployment, right? Stop on deployment. And Tim Kudlik, one of our presenters a while back, and he wrote a tool using WebPageTest API, actually, that Marcel Duran, developer of Wieslow, wrote. It's the same team of people. So he wrote a tool called Grunt Perf Budget, which basically lets you run a webpage test, synthetic test, on every deployment, and using any metric that it has, just say, never go above that, you know. And if it doesn't work, it will say, sorry, you're just too slow, right? He's still improving it. It's a relatively fresh tool, but it's an awesome way to do that, right? Because you can actually, I mean, you can see that speed index. It's not a magical number that this tool creates. It's a magical number that PageSpeed WebPageTest tool creates, right? But it can be any other metric, like page load time in my test environment, right? Or amount of requests that we are making to the page, or this. I mean, every metric that WebPageTest tracks. Basically, if you remember that show slow slide, there are like tons of metrics that each of those tools creates, and you can have a so-called budget. And then let the developers fight. I don't care, you know, who goes on vacation, right? As long as you spend only $1,000 on all of it, like across the group, it's okay. And same thing here. Like as long as you stay within the limit, it's okay. You fight to reducing that. And moreover, once you see the trend and it's kind of going good, you might adjust this eventually and kind of have your budget decreased, and well, maybe spend it on salary instead, right, or something like that. Yeah. There are plenty of tools that I do not describe. Actually, I believe perf budget. Well, I forgot which one uses what, but PhantomJS is used a lot, right? Like my Wieslow actually runs show slow using PhantomJS to collect. It's one of the easiest way to run Wieslow, for example, and collect the metrics, right? There are other tools like that do similar things, right? And I'm so glad we all spend a lot of time on developing those tools, although very few people say during the announcement section that they're developing the tool, right? Please, talk about it, right? But we have a lot of tools that were developed over the years, and it's a shame if you don't use them, because they're amazing. I mean, browser that doesn't have a screen, come on, it's complicated stuff, you know? It's very hard to build such things, and they were oftentimes built from scratch at the moment where people just couldn't live with existing status quo, you know. So having some of those sophisticated tools to do perf analysis and kind of break the build process on moment text is very useful. Another tool that actually didn't have that, and Google wrote their internal tool, they do visual comparisons. They don't care if it's JavaScript, CSS, or whatever broke something, right? They go and compare results using visual, like pixel by pixel analysis, right? And if there's too much change, something changed that you didn't expect, boom, it breaks, right? Again, not performance thing necessarily, but still very important to be part of the build process, right? So build process is essential for you to keep up the improvements and optimization work. Why? Because you cannot spend the same amount of effort every time you change the code. And with the amount of changes that you're making, performance has a chance to decrease a lot. And if you think about it, if you don't spend corresponding amount of monitoring and measurement time to the amount of development time, then it will always degrade. That's just simple as that. And you just will never have 90% of your project dedicated to performance forever, right? No one will give you that, right? So as much as automation as you can get from it, and luckily, performance is a great feature, but business only wants one thing. They want it faster, and they don't care about anything else, right? So you don't need to interact with the business. You can actually codify that. There is no, there is some subjective side of it, obviously, and many of us think that something is slow is better, right? But generally, optimizing performance can be tested automatically. If performance can be tested automatically, you should do that, right? Because every time you build, every time you have a chance to make a mistake, it will help you correct that. So please use build process, generally, and for performance in particular. So one thing that I mentioned in the build process that is actually one of the most critical pieces, right? When we talked about JavaScript and CSS being very important in the browser because JavaScript is execution, right, and very interactive, and CSS is responsible for layout of the whole page. It's kind of very critical for rendering. Well, the biggest thing on the internet, beyond video, which we don't need to cover, it has very different properties, is images. Images is majority of traffic online, outside video. For each page, I forgot the statistic today, but I believe it's 60% already, if not more than that. It's images. And obviously, with the retina displays and the awesome marketing potential that website can create, more images, right? You will never find a marketing person who will say, give me less images, right? Never, ever. Image costs 1,000 words, right? And weights at 2,000 words. Or maybe 2 million words, right? So you want to have image optimization. I actually gave a talk about image optimization in great detail. I'm actually giving a talk about it at Velocity next month. But generally, one of the huge concepts there is basically use smaller or have smaller files for the same images. Right? For the same visual experience, just use smaller files so they download faster, right? It's basic premise of image optimization. It's a little more complicated than that, but generally that's the approach. And there are a couple tools. One is called JPEG Mini, and another one is called Compressor.io, right? And there are a few others, right, that do a couple optimization, couple types of, or actually thousands of optimization, but a couple types of optimization, lossless optimization without losing the quality, and lossy with losing the quality but within a reasonable range, right, and auto-detecting the loss and stuff like that. And because of that, they have a magic property. You can just run it, and it will give you a smaller image, right? That's all, right? So it's ideal for build process automation, right? So on the example above, you can see that it accomplished 6.5 times optimization on that image, and the one on the left is original, the one on the right is optimized. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And I mean, I understand on this screen you might not be, but even on the good screen you cannot tell the difference like looking at it like that, right? And more importantly, in the grand scheme of things, for the user it actually doesn't make a difference, even if you can see a pixel left or pixel right. With some exceptions, you know, but generally the optimization can be this big, and I'm not kidding. This is a real number. It's not like, I mean, surely this is a pretty crazy. Sorry, I'm pointing at my screen. It's a really big optimization, and not every time you will have 6.5 times optimization. But 50% optimization, meaning like reducing the size in half, is common, right? And since creators of pictures don't care about performance of the websites generally. For like people who make photo cameras or designers who use Photoshop for visual representation, they don't care about performance when they do the work, right? They might care about performance when they use the website, and generally, like hopefully a good designer is a good UX person, but they don't care. And because of that, the situation of files that they produce is much worse than the files that you should be using. So image optimization is important key here. Again, there are a few other parts of optimization that you need to be aware of, but generally just use the tools like this. Just the last slide from my presentation, if you've been here in December last year, we reduced the size for our responsive website for the phone 10 times comparing to what it would have been if we didn't use image optimization. 10 times. Instead of 4 megs, it's 400K. I don't need to say much more than that. Yeah, he's saying that there are a couple grunt plugins that you can use, like ImageMin or some plugins that do responsive image optimization. Yeah. So yeah, I'm not saying that these are exclusive tools. These actually will do more than ImageMin, for example, will do. ImageMin doesn't do lossy optimization, which where a lot of optimization comes from. But yes, plug it into your process, right? I'm sorry, I cannot list every single line of code that you need to add. It's a lot of stuff. Yeah, you were saying. Yeah, you need to have another layer. He's talking about responsive images where just file size is, reducing file size is, you shouldn't have that done alone. You need to actually make sure that the pixel resolution matches the screen, right? I mean, that screen is very different than this screen, right? In terms of pixel, well, pixel-wise it might not, but you do need a different image. Yeah, I agree. And there are plenty of glue that you need to do to these today to glue them together. Unfortunately, you know, that's what my whole talk about at Velocity, right? And it probably doesn't cover everything either, you know. So pay attention to this field. Again, high level today. Sorry about that, but high level. So, okay. Another side of it is basically, right now we talked about developer tools, right? And tools for analysis and tools for optimization and development of build process. There are a few tools that make website work better than what we've learned when we first opened the view source of the web page, right? Browsers will do things in particular way. They code it that way for many, many reasons, right? That, trust me, everything was thought through a lot. So there are many reasons why browsers works the way it works. But there are a few, and by the way, that's the best tool we have. It constantly improves. Every user has it, or most of the users have the newest one. So let's not forget that browser developers developed that tool, right? I'm sorry, I'm not calling browsers a tool. It's kind of weird. But it is one of the greatest tools, right? They keep, one of the latest trends in browser development, improving performance, because they realize that they just have to do it, otherwise another browser will be sold, right? If you saw browser announcements, many of them said, we are faster, or this is our benchmark, like lately, right? Features are just much harder to sell. So there are a few tools that you would want, and again, this is just a subset, I'm sorry, and the very few particular tools, but that help page load and have user experience the page faster, right? It will probably do everything needed anyway, right? That you will need to code your page in a way that all of your functionality is still there, by the way. One thing that I'm not covering is tools on working with business and designers on changing design and functionality of the web page. Those tools we need to cover sometime else, and it's probably the best thing you can do because that will mean you only develop what's fast, right? But I'm not covering that today, right? But this will allow you to have experience of working with a page faster without necessarily all functionality to be faster, right? Good example is picture fill, which is actually the polyfill. I don't know if you're familiar with the term. Basically, a piece of JavaScript that lets you emulate responsive functionality that we had mentioned here, like picture tag and other responsive image things that let you have optimized images for particular device, right? Or render only images for particular device. Or require.js AMD loader, right, which is basically loads things only when they're needed. remember I mentioned the optimizer that combines modules only to things that you need to load on the page, but they also have a component that loads on the page, loads things when they're needed, right? And kind of asynchronous, you can codify it asynchronously load only. I mean, I can talk about loading JavaScript for ages, trust me. You probably, many of you probably heard me doing that a lot. So basically it's a class of tools that lets you render the page in a way that is different. Including lazy loaders, for example, a very common technique, right? There are many tools written where you can just use them, like the library that says, hey, images with this or images with this class, just don't load them on the original page load. We had, well, Meet for Speed last month, or this month actually, was at Business Insider. It's a newspaper, very long page, very, very long waterfall. You cannot print it on one T-shirt. I had a T-shirt with a waterfall diagram a long time ago, but you cannot print it on one T-shirt. It's like probably from here to the next floor or something, right? And it's not the worst case scenario, right? But you don't need to load everything to render first experience, or even you can load things. I mean, you probably know what lazy loading means, right? Many of you probably, or infinite scroll is another name of it from another perspective, right? Like Facebook, you can learn about everything about your friends forever, but you don't have to wait forever to start learning about everything about your friends, right? And there are many other tools like that. Again, many of them already became libraries that you can just use, right? And be careful with them. Understand how they work, if they're doing exactly what you want, and not degrading performance, because sometimes they're written for different reasons, right? And can degrade performance. Like, for example, one of the first responsive images code on Apple.com, well, not one of the first, but first, when they released the Retina displays, was awesome. It loaded all of the images, not only for the device you are on, but every other image as well. Right? All high resolution, low resolution, everything. I mean, you cannot blame them, right? I mean, you cannot predict all of those complications all the time, unless you have perf budget thing, you know. But make sure you know what the tool is used for, how it is used. Many of them actually stop being reasonably useful, like Modernizer, for example, is a tool that becomes less and less relevant because browsers actually improve over time, and you don't need to load that much. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely pay attention to forward compatibility. It will help you a lot when you, in the future, you will review your performance and say, "Oh, awesome! We picked the right way of doing it, and let's keep going that way." Right? So, I'm sorry. I keep saying, "Oh, it's a tool; it will do it," and then I say, "Okay," and keep paying attention to it. Right? Unfortunately, that's how it works, right? Don't use a drill on your leg, right? Don't, you know, tools are good, but you need to make sure that you use them right. And the one I repeat it again, tools are written by people. Some tools go stale and break after that, right? Because they're no longer actual. Some tools have bugs. Well, every single tool has a bug. There is always an edge case with every single tool. Just make sure you understand that and contribute changes to, to open source tools at least. And some tools are good for something and not good for another thing. Like remember the synthetic tool testing was good for development, but not really good for RUM. Many people tried to use synthetic tools and show slow to emulate kind of like continuous monitoring and testing, and it just didn't provide enough value there, right? I mean, it still provides some value for you, but it's not replacing the other one. Don't confuse what you're getting from a tool. I'm very upset because they invented this RUM thing and show slow is no longer needed. You know? Well, frankly, I'm upset that I don't have time to work on show slow. That's sad, you know, or don't have enough time, I should say. Okay, last but not least is a class of tools that that are responsible for delivering kind of real-time tools, right? You can say that the network is a tool, although you don't have to hold it in your hand; it doesn't have rubber handles or something, right? But there are tools that are in your control, right? Between you, your server, and your user, there is a lot of stuff going on. Starting with keyboard, but then there is a network and a lot of things on the network, right? And if you ever saw a waterfall, you can just go crazy if you think about how many things it touched during the work of the page, right? So there is one tool that people disregard as important, but it's gzip module, for example, right? I know it's not really a tool, it's just a module, right? And just gzips. But it's a huge improvement if you don't have that enabled, right? So learn your web server, learn your Apache. Maybe there are things that are misconfigured in there because you wanted to do better. Maybe you wanted it to scale better. And then you reduce performance for everybody forever because of that, right? There is a particular setting that you can do that does that, right? And so learn the tools that serve your website, right? ModGzip is one of them. Caches of all kinds. Very common caches are memcached, right? For example, memcache, right? It's object cache or a SQL query cache within your backend, right? But that's not only, these are not the only caches that there are. Well, there are browser caches. There are things like Varnish that, or services provided by many of the CDNs that cache content on the edge or on some point of your server without redoing it. Cache is a common technique for improving performance of every kind, right? Don't do the work, just have a result ready, right? If nothing changed, why to recompute it, right? Dynamic stuff is awesome, but computers cannot forever do everything, right? So Varnish is one of the most frequently used front-end caches that you control, like your piece of software. I mean, Squid was one of the first ones, but it was kind of hard to use. But Varnish, I mean, there are many tools, right? So caching is something you might want to use. Then CDNs, or content delivery networks, is a whole class of things that help you fight latency. We can talk about why that happens, but basically, the farther something is, the longer it will take to get from point A to point B. That's just general rule. There are many there are many things to say why that happens, but and it affects your web pages a lot, especially when you have many requests. That's why one of the first rules for performance optimization is reduce the amount of requests. The more requests you have, the more latency affects you. And there is no way to solve it. If your users are in China and you're in America, well, there is a distance between China and America. I mean, there is no way to do anything about it. But there are servers in China. Well, China might be edge case with all the firewall case, but all over the world, there are, well, Moscow might have a firewall soon too, so bad example again. Well, Australia, America, right? Good situation, good case where, why not to have your files in Australia? Why the hell do you care where they are, right? Let them serve faster. So they basically, core promise of regular CDN is serving your content from the closest location to the user, right? At least that's what we now call a CDN, right? CDN kind of narrowed down the features to just that, the geographical distribution, be close to the user, right? And there are many, I mean, Akamai became a huge, gigantic company doing just that. I mean, they also did it for video to save traffic. I mean, there are many other benefits, but generally, the closer it is, the better, and people acknowledge that. Another new type of product that we mentioned on our sponsor slide a lot is front-end optimization, right? So basically, we talked about optimizations. Well, doing it as a developer is relatively hard, so there are many other tools developed by now, like Akamai has a product through acquisition, InstantLogic we mentioned, Redware has appliances, Yota is a new, well, they're not that new, but they're just coming to the market with their product, and PageSpeed is open source tool by Google. They actually have a service like that. They provide it for you, right? That paid service. Or you can use just Apache module to automatically apply optimizations. And that is critical because, well, frankly, when we did image optimization project at truTV, at the end, or maybe by now, when we did a few other iterations to it, I'm thinking that maybe I should have used automation instead. Why do I need to worry about it? I have so many features to deliver. Maintaining some of these complicated things is just hard. And more importantly, keeping up with all of those browser changes across the world with real time, like if this user came from that browser, it means the best optimization is this, right? You just cannot, regular developer team cannot follow all of that, right? So optimization use case is very strong, very important, and created a lot of value by having that service, right? So pay attention to that. Those can be well worth your efforts, right? Especially if you have very limited resources in development and don't want to, or just incapable of following all of that, which drives me crazy, and I want to do performance optimization, you know. So just take a look at front-end optimization tools of any kind. FEO is a particular terminology. There are other tools like InstantLogic, for example, is doing web app streaming. It's a little bit different technology, and the point is that they apply real-time optimizations of different kind, right? So take a look at the whole class of usually services or hardware or infrastructure pieces that will go and speed up things for you. Starting with that checkbox to enable gzip. Trust me, if you don't do that, it's very, very bad. Your sysadmin made a huge mistake for that, right? It's not a good. Keep alive is another one. Like two settings that you just don't do it right if you set them in the wrong position. You know, and sometimes they are by default and they never change, or sometimes they change for a different reason without realizing what the effect is. But so pay attention to those class of tools that you can have. Again, CDNs are a huge commercial offering from various providers. You might want to check that out. And that's kind of it from what I envisioned to be a set of tools, right? I'm sorry if it took a lot of time, but this is what we need to know, and this is awesome thing that we have all of those tools available. When we started, we couldn't even have a waterfall diagram drawn, so that's about it. So I'll be happy to answer a few questions if you have any, and also I know many of you already mentioned tools that you use, but I would like to, after that, to open if anyone wants to say about their tools. So let's start with the questions. The web server. So the question is, over the years, there are many web servers got developed, and some people chose to different paths and using different web servers, and they being developed constantly. Well, and is there a value in looking into that for performance? Absolutely. There's absolutely a lot of value in that. In particular, scalability component that affects performance is important because well, first of all, Apache was developed first version of Apache was developed a long time ago, and they had to keep a lot of legacy, and the approach that they took was particular, right? They had a few different options now with the core components of Apache that you can swap them, right? And mitigate some of the issues. But generally, Apache was not built to be as scalable as Nginx is, for example, for particular reasons, for like with the way they handle events and the way they handle resources of the server while it executes the code, right? Basically, it's using pools of resources versus Apache allocating resources per connection, for example, right? So you ran out of memory quite quickly, and ran out of basically those resources that you allocate, right? It's not only memory. From that perspective, definitely take a look. There is another reason why you would want to take a look at new web servers or new modules for existing web servers and things like that. Not more gzip, which is already there for every web server. Please enable it I will say it 5 times. It's new protocols and new optimizations. For example, Speedy protocol or HTTP 2.0 protocol that is getting here slowly but surely, right? We had a session a couple of months ago about it. That protocol is very fundamentally different, and old servers like, I'm not sure Lighty will ever support it. It might actually, I'm wrong. I actually don't know enough about those, but some of the developer servers that you know, Ruby can spawn just for development purposes definitely shouldn't be used in production. And same applies to every server. You just need to evaluate how it works. And by the way, HTTP 2.0 protocol will make website faster unless you did something wrong already, or overused some best practices that you shouldn't have, right? Or generally. Basically, it's a performance improvement over HTTP protocol, right? So to get those optimizations for sure. And there are other things like WebSockets, for example, right? Things that are not necessarily your performance improvement tool, although you can say that WebSockets are performance improvement tool, right? Over long polling and things like that. But other features of the protocol. So definitely pay attention. In that sense, it's worth doing that. And from scale, again, from scalability and availability, well, no web server should exist if it can go down by itself without application bringing it down, right? But scalability-wise, definitely, well, lack of scale can cause availability problems. But anyway, so yeah, pay attention to that still. Yeah, and I'm sorry, if you know me for a while, I kind of look from front-end perspective at everything, right? Because I think that's a very important piece of performance that was neglected for way too long. But it doesn't mean that back-end is not necessary or you shouldn't pay attention to. It's definitely very important. Yeah, yeah. But every tool is good for something. You just need to know what it is good for. And yeah, you cannot just read it in documentation. The documentation says it's awesome for everything. Yeah, check it out, Nginx. Sarah Novotny, who is a chair of OSCON conference, is now their evangelist, for example. So you should definitely check it out. They're paying attention into evangelizing and putting a lot of documentation out and all of that. So yeah. Yes. For example. Yeah. Yeah. So the question was, what do I use for load testing, right? Well, if you ask me, I don't use anything for load testing. Right, for various reasons, it doesn't matter why. But I started the talk by saying that I want to separate the issue of scale and reliability from issue of performance, right? And while they're all interconnected, there is no separate thing out there. Performance, in a sense of scale and availability, is such a researched and well-developed topic that everyone who you ask for performance immediately asks you about load testing, right? And that is well-developed field. You're absolutely right. JMeter is one of them, a very known open source tool that many vendors actually also use. And there are a few services like Sosta is one of them that does load testing from the cloud in particular, because one of the issues is how do you scale the load as well very quickly, right? So, but that applies to testing performance degradation based on load. And what I wanted to talk about is, and what this meetup generally covers, although we also talk about load testing rarely, but we do, is how does your performance, what is your web performance experience for users irrespective of load, right? And oftentimes, unfortunately, it still sucks. You know, you might not have a scale problem and still have terrible performance. Well, every business has potential improvement on, to be had in there, but many businesses have that problem. So sorry if I didn't answer your question, but you know, Alex is a big proponent of load testing and very knowledgeable resource about that, and in performance in particular, but load testing and scalability, you can talk to him. Alex, you want to talk about particular tools that are really good to use today, other than JMeter? No. Yeah. So, I'm sorry if I have that personal stance about this situation, but I believe it's important to pay attention to that other side as well, and that's critical today. Yeah, again, there's no like one regular simple line between scale and performance, right? Every resource can fail to scale, and many of them are in your control, and many of them are not in your control. The ones in your control are usually servers, in some little way networks, right? And the code you write, right? And first request, so-called first request, the HTML request is a bottleneck, and if it's slow, everything is slow, absolutely. And that one is usually the one that's affected by traditional scalability problems for different components in your system, right? That was the first one to reduce performance based on the load, right? But many resources like network, for example, even though it can bottleneck on the source, right, when you have a lot of load, and definitely does. Trust me, truTV did Michael Jackson cases, and I definitely know what network bottleneck is, you know. Network is much more scalable by nature. It's much more simple in terms of scale. There are many other complicated issues, like latency is the one that is actually very hard to battle, but scale is relatively easy. And again, I probably insult every network engineer out there by saying so, you know, but comparing to the database optimizations or code issues that we usually have in our systems, networks are generally easier to scale, right? So a lot of things that bottleneck on network or would bottleneck on network just never reach that because you usually have problems somewhere else, you know. And you know, every resource can bottleneck. The notion that in browser performance will never bottleneck on scale because only one user uses one browser. You cannot really have, even if two users, they fight for the mouse anyway, so the bottleneck is on the input device. I'm joking here, right? So a lot of stuff that is dependent on the browser is not having as many scale issues, although the browser profiling that we covered still talks about that. Oh, you mean when you commit the code? That's it. Yeah. So when it's a good point. There is another point in the development process that is kind of a good place to insert performance measurement tools or performance, maybe even performance optimization. Well, not performance optimizations probably, but performance management tools is commit events on your source code repository, right? And frankly, it depends on what happens more frequently, you build or your source control, because we, for example, we build before we commit. You know, so just to give you an example. But yeah, if you want to test every commit, it can also happen, absolutely, at any moment, yeah. Well, regular expressions is a great and powerful tool. I'm a Perl guy in the past, I love them. You can write one-liner and move the mountain. The trouble is that oftentimes they are a simple understatement of reality. Yes, it's not a parser. So be careful with regexes. Although, obviously, if you want to test for particular, like for hash sign to be used as an ID, maybe you can do that. Although, you better look at parser that Nicholas Zakos wrote because he spent too much time on that. You know, you will have a new CSS developer bringing new piece of code that, like, a good example is data URIs, right, where you encode the image into your CSS file, and your regex will just die, or will find something else, or will mix it. So, Yeah. No, sure. Simple tests are much better than no tests. You know, so if you run them frequently, it helps a lot. Anyone else? I'll be here for some time as well. Yeah. Okay. So no more questions. We'll do a raffle. Raffle is awesome. So if you didn't put your business card, please do so, and please pass the bag around so everyone can have a chance. Yeah. Oh, before the raffle, we have a question. Yes, sorry. Sorry. I believe it was Ilya Grigoric who wrote a good, detailed description of why you need to go back to async tags. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what good? We were talking about the trend. You need to monitor trends in how browsers work. Otherwise, you're screwed. Well, you might not be screwed if you didn't do anything. If you're still using original code, well, it will perform probably equally bad, right? But if you do optimizations, yes, be careful, because some of those optimizations can be an anti-pattern and will decrease the performance comparing to what you could have achieved with a native developer's browser support, for example. And async tag is one example, although I would be careful reading just one article about it. Ilya is great. Ilya wrote an awesome book about browser networking. You should all read it. I really mean it. It's a really good, detailed book of all the aspects. He worked with many people trying to gather data about it, and he has a lot of experience, right? But it pinpoints one particular reason to go back to async tags, right? But there are other reasons why you would not do that, right? Like browser support, for example. Yeah, that's why I said that automation might be your answer for some people. For some people, keep reading Perf Planet account. Well, unfortunately, I don't retweet there as often, but keep monitoring the field. Don't just don't do optimization once. Embed optimization into performance, into your development process, period. Pay attention. That's why like Meet for Speed started as internal meetings that are organized at my company. Every week we would just, to this day, we just meet and look at performance of the websites, either for a particular project or just talk about trends or something like that, or pay attention, because otherwise it will fly away. You know, you will be in trouble. I wish tools today were as awesome as and everything you just put more money into the bank and everything is just faster, you know. I mean, many companies achieve quite a lot and you probably have less money that they want for what they could achieve, right? So you can probably tune quite a lot by just putting money into it. That's why it's actually great, because people can actually, those people spend those money in actually spending time understanding all the differences. So that's how they do it, and codify it or whatever, professional services or not, right? So no answer. There's no simple way of just being faster, right? No simple way. Although the discussion about working with the designers and product people to try to build faster things to start with might be a great investment. The earlier it is in the process, the better, generally. Fighting their crazy ideas sometimes is harder. You know? Yeah, one of the main issues is performance will degrade if you don't pay attention. So performance budget is important. You don't actually need to research up front and pick something. You can just pick current values that you have today and just make sure it doesn't go over. And then slowly but surely decrease that number, because, you know, it can be smaller, I'm positive, or bigger depending on the metric, but yeah. If you build from scratch, yeah, but if you're modifying existing one, first rule is don't make it worse, you know, which many people do. Yeah. Okay, so I'll be around and we can talk, and yeah, thank you.